Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charlie Nicklin. I'm the Chief Exec of IAgrE, and I'd like to thank you all for joining our final presentation of 2023, believe it or not. I'd like to welcome Dr. Andy Scarlett as our guest speaker today. Andy has been involved in ag engineering since 1985. He spent 16 years at Silso Research Institute, where he was responsible for the management of tractor and machinery-related testing and research activities. In 2005, he formed Scarlett Research, which specialises in the delivery of R&D and technical consultancy for ag tractors and equipment to both the private and the public sector. This is the second time we've had Andy present, and the difference in presentation highlights the diversity of our industry. So from trailer braking last time, we're now going to be talking about harvesting thatching straw. As usual, with our lectures, everyone will be muted. So if you'd like to ask questions, please pop them in the chat function. And then we'll ask at the end of the presentation. So I'll now hand over to Andy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IAgrE Lunchtime Lecture. As the title suggests, it's all about harvesting and processing thatching straw and the machinery which is used for that. So go on and tell you a little bit about that in a moment. Firstly, just a little bit of background. Charlie has already said who we are, what we do, or rather what I do. Rather a diverse range of activities over what, believe it or not, is now 18 years since Scarlett Research Limited has been in business. And a lot of it's involved tractors and field machinery, but a lot hasn't. And today is about field machinery and indeed static processing machinery, but in a completely different genre. So with no more ado, let's talk about thatching straw. So why have I been doing this work? How did it come to pass? Well, almost exactly a year ago, I had a phone call from a lady, a very kind lady called Alison Henry from Historic England. And she explained that Historic England, working in conjunction with Historic Environment Scotland, were concerned about the future supply of thatching straw in the UK. This had been adversely affected by poor harvest conditions and a number of other factors, and it was Historic England and Historic Environment Scotland were concerned that there would be potential future shortages moving forward, which may affect market supply to be able to deal with listed buildings and other such things. Now, first thing you have to understand is we all think about thatched roofs being thatched with perhaps water reed, which is one material which is used, but it is also thatched with straw. But there are two distinct straw thatching products, long straw and combed wheat reed, which I'll tell you more about in a few moments. So the concern was as far as Historic England and Historic Environment Scotland was whether the viability of thatching straw production was being adversely affected by perhaps labour-intensive harvesting methods which were being used by many growers, reliance on older, perhaps less reliable machinery, or whether there were other factors. So the actual purpose of the study we were commissioned to undertake was to identify what options existed to either improve or enhance existing crop harvesting machinery, or indeed replace it, to make current thatching straw production more efficient, less labour intensive, more financially viable for the grower, and also safer. So what actual crop harvesting methods and equipment are used at the moment? Well, a wide range, as I'll come on to explain. But the equipment and methods which are used all have the ability to affect the nature of the product in terms of the quality of the product, also the availability and supply of the product, because factors such as machinery work rate, machinery operating costs, the reliability of the equipment, even the availability of the equipment, and indeed the manual labour required and the cost of that manual labour, either to use the equipment or indeed to undertake associated processes relating to the use of such equipment, all have an influence. So the question was, can appropriate mechanization solutions make thatching straw production more cost effective and sustainable, but without adversely affecting the quality of the end product? And in which case, what would be the best mechanization options to pursue in order to achieve that objective? So first off, a little bit about thatching straw growing in England. Not much is grown in Scotland at all. Some is used in Scotland, but most of it is sourced from England. As you can see, nearly 2/3 of thatching straw is grown in the southwest. The east of England and the southeast make up the remainder. But yeah, when I talk about the southwest, effectively I mean anywhere from Hampshire and Wiltshire heading west. In terms of the size of growers, the number of growers, there are approximately 60 growers of thatching straw in the UK at the moment. So it's an extremely small niche market. Of those, about 12% grow over 150 acres per year. Forgive the old style values, but we're going back in time, and I'm afraid, as far as this is concerned. About 40% of the growers, namely those of more than 60 acres a year, account for about 80% of UK straw production. About 60% of growers plant less than 60 acres a year, but they only account for about 20% of UK production. But they are an important sector. In many cases, these are thatchers or thatching companies who actually grow a small area each year themselves in order to ensure availability of appropriate materials for their own use. So what are we dealing with? Two different end products. As I mentioned, we have long straw and combed wheat reed. Combed wheat reed is a bit of a misnomer because it's not reed at all. It's wheat straw, but it's just been processed in a different manner. So the only difference between these two is effectively the crop processing method employed. In the case of long straw, the entire crop passes through a threshing mechanism, a threshing drum effectively, to remove the grain and the chaff. The straw is subject to a certain limited mechanical damage during that process, as you can imagine, when it goes through the drum and concave. But the majority of plant leaves remain attached to the stem. The drums are set to be very gentle on the crop as much as possible. Some broken and shorter straw pieces are mixed in with the end product. And then finally, before it can be used for thatching on a roof, it requires further preparation, making into yelms, which involves soaking the straw, laying it in a big bed on the floor, soaking it with water, and then drawing it out and packaging it back into almost sheaves to carry up onto the roof. Combed wheat reed, on the other hand, is processed in a different way. As you'll see, the crop passes through a reed comber. This is a special device that sits on top of a standard threshing drum. Within the reed comber, there are a number of rotating tines which actually comb out the grain from the ears and the heads, but those grain-free heads usually remain on the stems. The stems are also combed as well, and all the plant leaf material and broken straw is removed. So consequently, you end up with just the straight plant stems with the combed out heads on the top end, straight and undamaged. And that's then ready for immediate placement on the roof. Historically, combed wheat reed was used in the West counties and the West Country on roofs, whereas long straw was anywhere from Oxford east would have been a long straw thatched roof. That's now changed quite a bit, and we're seeing combed wheat reed gradually creep over to more and more of the UK, and long straw now is almost left in Essex and East Anglia. It is cheaper to thatch in terms of man hours to thatch a roof in combed wheat reed than long straw, because the cone wheat reed doesn't require the same pre-preparation prior to thatching, but cone wheat reed is worth about twice the cost of long straw for that reason. Right, so we have two different products, but just to make things even more slightly complicated, we have two different harvesting methods as well. What we call, or what I've called, the conventional method and the alternative method. So what are these things then? Well, in the case of the conventional method, this is what you would have imagined to have been the way of harvesting cereals prior to the combine harvester. The crop is cut by binder when it's partly ripe. It's subsequently ripened in the field in stooks or shocks, depending on where you come from. Then it's carted with the grain still obviously on the sheaves, and subsequently the grain is removed from the sheaves as a separate post-harvest operation, usually performed over winter. Obviously the straw is subject to a certain but limited mechanical damage during processing, and as you can see, the conventional method can be used either for long straw or combed wheat reed, doesn't matter. The alternative method involves grain being removed in field from the standing crop at a more advanced stage of ripeness, usually by use of a stripper header. And then the straw is subsequently harvested, processed, and packaged in field as a separate operation. And then from that point, it requires no further processing, it's ready to be sold and to go onto the roof, depending on what level of preparation it needs, whether it be long straw or combed wheat reed. At the moment, about 80% of the crop in the UK is harvested by conventional methods and about 20% by alternative methods. It's mainly larger growers that use the alternative method, but we'll show you a bit more about that in a moment. So what are the requirements of any mechanization solution, be it for thatching straw harvesting or indeed for anything else? Well, it's got to my mind, save time and money. It mustn't be detrimental to straw product quality. It's got to suit the needs of the grower in terms of the daily work rate it can achieve, the level of complexity of the machine or lack of complexity, and its ease of use. The equipment's got to be reliable, and the ownership and operating costs have got to be sensible as well. These aren't activities which lend themselves to large machines operated on a contract basis, because as you can imagine, it's just like haymaking. Everybody wants to harvest their thatching straw at exactly the same time, when the weather's right, in a very limited window. So you can't wait for somebody to turn up. It's just too late. Any solution has got to suit local growing and harvesting conditions. And of course, it's got to be economically viable. It's got to pay for itself over time. And if possible, it needs to integrate with the other harvesting and processing techniques which are already employed on the enterprise without significant modification. Now, that's a big wish list, but you've got to hit a good 85% of them, I would say, in order to satisfy the requirements of the grower. So during early 2023, I merrily went round quite a bit of the country and talked to thatching straw growers to ask them what equipment and methods they were using for the different stages in crop harvesting and processing, which of course can be one and the same operation and can be two complete separate operations depending on how they're performed. So those activities involve crop cutting, crop ripening, which may be done in the field as a separate operation or may be done prior to crop cutting. Any intermediate packaging which may be undertaken to aid transportation from the field to the store. Storage methods which are used until crop processing, if it hasn't already been done, then the crop processing techniques used, and then subsequently packaging for onward sale and use by the thatcher. So for each of those current harvesting and processing systems which are in use at the moment, we asked, or rather I asked, what were their advantages that they felt they had, any restrictions and difficulties, and areas which could be identified as requiring improvement. Also, what to their mind were the desirable thatching straw qualities in terms of their quality characteristics, and also, in the view of the growers, any possible harvesting or processing techniques which could be detrimental to product quality. Okay, so here is a typical process flowchart for conventional harvesting and processing methods. As you can see, to begin with, the crop is cut with a binder, then it's placed in, the sheaves are placed in stooks for ripening. Depending on the year, that may be no more than a week. As in this last year, which was a damn difficult July and early August, some stood in the shook for over a month and had to be turned many times to dry out. Crop packaging to aid transportation to storage, that there are a number of methods which can be used for that. It may just be forked onto a trailer, but frequently many growers use various alternative packaging methods to permit mechanical handling and speed that method up and reduce the labor input there. There's then, of course, the transportation to store, and then finally crop processing with either a reed comber or a threshing drum, and finally packaging it all up again so it can be sold to the thatcher. So let's look at some of those activities in action. Now, a number of things to note there. That was a PTO-driven binder. Believe it or not, a lot of binders which are used are still land wheel driven because some growers prefer them. They say they can turn quicker on the corners and get higher output from them. One man on the binder, and as you can see, 5 there, putting the sheaves up in stooks straight away. You'll also notice that on a modern wheat crop, as of this, well, say modern, old varieties are used for thatching straw production, old wheat varieties, in order to get sufficient length, sufficient height of the straw. But you notice you've got 5 people stooking, and the actual sheaves are laying so close to each other, they're almost touching. There's not a sheave's length between successive sheaves which are being dropped out by the binder. So we go on to the next page, and you'll see the screen, and you'll see a reverse view. Now that particular grower, you'll notice, didn't have anybody on the seat on the binder. That's a rarity. Most operators have somebody on the tractor and somebody on the binder as well. When asked why, I was told it's the only enjoyable job of the entire process, and so we don't like to take it away from anybody half the time. Yeah, there are important controls to operate on a binder to adjust the cutting height, the position of the reel, the height of the reel, the fore and aft position of the reel, and also the point where the string is tied around the middle of the sheaf. That has to be adjusted as well, depending on the height of the crop. So if the crop height varies, you need to have somebody that knows what they're doing on the binder. All of those things could be automated to a degree, or at least made remote, but then you can't see it so well from a tractor seat. Of course, in the days when it was a horse, it wasn't so bad because the one person at the back drove the motive power and also at the same time controlled the binder. Right, so now we look at crop packaging. Once the crop has dried in the field and ripened sufficiently, as I mentioned, it can either be forked onto a trailer and carted straight to the barn, but then of course that's hand work again. But a number of growers use big balers. Some use to package the sheaves, the tied sheaves, into larger packages for handling. Some use the large balers, such as this one, this Howard big baler that you may remember from the 1970s, those of you that are old enough. Others use large round balers. Some use clamshell type packaging cages where material is, or the sheaves are actually placed in the clamshell, and then it closes down onto the bundle of crop, and then strings are tied around it manually. But still, here you'll see the baler picking up sheaves which have been laid on the ground laterally across 90 degrees to the direction of travel of the tractor. But interestingly, if you look closely, you will see that they've been laid alternately, so that the butt ends of the sheaves and the head end of the sheaves are alternate down the swath. This is because the head end is larger than the butt end, and if you put all the heads at one end and the butts at the other end, you'd end up with a conical bale. So you have to alternate them appropriately. Nothing is ever simple when it comes to thatching straw. The Howard baler has got a very gentle action when it's used at a reduced PPO speed. And these machines are now in quite very sought after actually for this particular operation. They make much more money than they ever did when they were new. Effectively, they are a very gentle press type action which forms the material into the chamber, the box really. When the chamber is completely filled, then rather like the round baler, you then have to stop and then trip the knockers separately. 3 strands of twine are placed around the entire bale, and it's just somewhere between big baler twine and standard baler twine in thickness. So the knot is about to be, you watch carefully, the knot is just about to be triggered. There we go. And then finally, to eject the bale, the tail gate is tripped, and then the next bale being formed pushes the existing bale out. Now, despite the fact that the swaths have to be, or windrows have to be formed by hand, then once you've got them into those bread loaf type bales, at least then all mechanical or all handling until thrashing can be done by a telehandler or a tractor loader. So it does speed the job up no end when it comes to actually doing the next piece of work. So there's the essential issue as far as the conventional harvesting and processing methods are concerned. Each of those red circles involves an element of manual handling. So, and where there's manual handling, there's a labor requirement, and that labor costs money. It may not always be available when you need it. And so that's some of the issues which are encountered with the conventional method, let alone some of the age of the equipment which are in use. Looking at the alternative harvesting and processing method, here things are quite considerably different. Now, straight off, the crop, as I mentioned, is harvested at a much advanced stage of ripeness. So the grain would be probably 18, 19% moisture, whereas it would be still cheesy when it's cut with a binder. So grain removal is by stripper header, and then the straw is cut as a separate operation. Some growers use modified swathers to form a windrow, which can then be baled. Others use dedicated pieces of machinery for actually combing out or cutting and combing the straw to remove the leaf, because although the stripper header will have taken say 85% of the grain off, it won't necessarily have touched the leaves and further down the plant stem. And so if you want combed wheat reed, you've got to still comb the crop out. So there's got to be a certain amount of combing and residual grain removal undertaken in the field. Then the crop has got to be packaged by one way or another. That may be through a round baler, or it may be via manual packaging. And then finally, once you've got it packaged, you can transport it mechanically to store and to the end customer. So let's look at some of those processes in a little bit more detail. This is one particular grower from Berkshire. Okay, that looks a little bit different, but it's not necessarily the be all and end all as far as thatchers are concerned. It suits certain products, but not necessarily all. So as far as the alternative harvesting and processing method is concerned, the only area which requires any manual input, and not all in all systems, would be the actual crop packaging. As you'll see, those ladies and gentlemen there on that particular system forming it into bales on that dedicated trailer. Some people, though, as I mentioned, use round bales instead. You may think, well, hold on, there's 6 people working there. That's not a very effective system. Well, in actual fact, those 6 people can clear 20 acres a day. That's quite effective in many respects. So again, it depends the value of the product, how it works, how it's been the market it's going to. So what are the issues as far as alternative methods of crop harvesting and processing? Well, unfortunately, as always, there are some drawbacks and disadvantages. A stripper header requires a consistent crop air height in order to work effectively and remove the grain from the crop. And it also requires level fields. So small fields in Devon aren't necessarily the best place to use stripper headers. Also, of course, we're using older wheat varieties that grow taller. And one aspect of those older wheat varieties is the fact that their air height tends to be a lot less consistent than modern wheat varieties. When I'm talking older wheat varieties, I'm talking things like Maris Widgeon from the 1960s, and before that, Squarehead Master, and all sorts of weird and wonderful types. If you don't get the grain out, and a stripper header will only remove about 85% of the grain from the crop if it's being used gently so as not to excessively damage the straw, then some residual grain will remain on the plant stems. And that then means that if that's not removed by another method, when it goes onto a roof, it will then grow. So you'll see things on Facebook of people talking about the fact that they've got nice newly thatched roofs which have now got a good crop of wheat on them. and then are being sprayed with Roundup to kill the wheat. Well, never mind. Also, the crop is harvested later, so it's more mature. Some thatchers will or are of the opinion that a later harvested crop has less inherent flexibility and is less suited to their specific requirements. Other thatchers see no issue with that material and are perfectly happy to use it. There are various schools of thought in this, but they must be considered. And also packaging of the cut and processed straw, depending on how that is done. There's the scope for crop damage or further crop damage there if you're not careful. And that probably requires attention to detail. So are there areas for improvement? Well, in reality, not that many. It's already a highly productive and labor efficient activity. The operator environment, as you can see, is very good. But certain aspects in our view of crop handling and packaging could perhaps be refined to enhance product quality. But in all things, whether there's a demand for such refined product quality remains to be seen. So what about the conventional method? Well, things are a bit different there. For a start, you've got relatively poor work rate, often inadequate work rate unless you've got multiple items of machinery, which of course then require multiple people on them. A very large and costly manual labor requirement, an increasingly poor manual labor availability due to various factors, which I'm sure I don't need to speak to you about. Also, you've got a relatively unhealthy, dusty working condition whilst during crop processing, which is not much fun if you've got a considerable volume of crop to process for the larger growers. It's one thing if you've got 20 acres to thrash out over the winter. It's another thing if you've got 60 or 100 acres to thrash out and you're expecting your blokes to stand there doing it when you need 4, 5, 6 or 7 people to work a thrashing drum. Also, of course, we're relying on old, worn and often unreliable machinery for which there is poor or no spare parts availability. And as for machinery guarding, well, yeah, let's not talk too much about that. So it's less efficient than the alternative harvesting and processing method, and it presents a far greater scope for inefficiency improvements and overall cost reduction by adopting appropriate mechanization solutions, especially given the fact that 80% of the growers in the UK at the moment are using these techniques. So what are those areas for improvement? Well, in the early 1950s, 1959, 1960, the Farm Economics Department at Cambridge University did a study of the man hours involved to or required to harvest cereal crops, conventional cereal crops, either by binder and threshing or by combine harvester. And those values for the binder and the threshing are still pertinent today. Essentially, as you can see, man hours per acre. Cutting the corn by binder wasn't too bad. Stooking was a labor intensive job, as we know. But carting and stacking and thrashing required an awful lot of labor. Because it's not just a case of when you're thrashing, you've got to feed the material into the machine, you've then got to take it back out again, you've got to package it afterwards, and also get rid of the grain as well. But the carting and the stacking, as you can see, have just as high a labour requirement as the thrashing, which is quite surprising, and also very poor productivity. And of course, the crop is out there at risk of getting wet all the time. So this has highlighted the repeated manual handling of the crop is the main problem, and is a key area to mechanise if at all possible. These are the values or the costs for a grower are very careful and, well, I think there's a 5,000 acre farm actually down in Dorset, which also runs 60 acres of thatching straw. And these are his figures that he has kept for his costs. As you can see, stooking costs him over £150 per acre, and carting and stacking is 300. So when you start to add that lot up, before you even get as far as thrashing, you can see the actual costs involved in the job. So what about thatching straw quality? I've already mentioned it, but the maintenance of straw quality is an important requirement, and it mustn't be adversely affected by the techniques and the systems used. As I mentioned, opinions differ amongst thatchers regarding the respective superiority of either the conventionally harvested crop or the alternatively harvested crop. Many consider the conventional product to be superior, whereas some others most certainly do not. Most agree that many factors determine the product quality more than just simply the harvesting and the process methods used. Obviously, the crop type and varieties, the seasonal conditions that you get, and the treatment during the growing season. But an underlying fact is that straw harvested by each method are well established in the marketplace, and neither is going to die out tomorrow. So any solutions, any mechanization solutions and improvements must consider both methods. So where are the areas for machinery improvements? Most certainly in the in-field crop handling for crop ripening and stooking in the conventional method. Also for the conventional method in the means used for in-field crop packaging prior to transport to store. Again, trying to take some of that labour out and trying to make equipment more reliable. In terms of crop processing, the actual crop transfer into the processing equipment and then subsequently from it, and that overall requirement in the conventional method, that could be improved no end as well without substantial complexity. And then also in the conventional method, the actual operator working environment when crop processing. That's one thing if the threshing drum is stood outside, like in that picture, but all too often to permit use throughout the winter, they're inside buildings. And so you need to have appropriate dust extraction systems to improve the operator's environment. Because remember, everything that's going through there has to be fed in by hand and is handled multiple times even before it's fed into the damn machine. And finally, one area in the alternative harvesting method, and that's to enhance product quality by means of improved in-field crop handling and packaging where appropriate. So the initial conclusions of this piece of work were that, yeah, unfortunately, the UK thatching straw production industry is a small niche market, and it's extremely unlikely to attract dedicated machinery, new machinery from commercial manufacturers at a reasonable cost that growers could afford. Unfortunately, that's just not going to happen, in my opinion. At present, growers must satisfy their machinery requirements either by the use of old, what we would call vintage agricultural machinery operated in traditional ways, or by adapting and repurposing newer commercial agricultural machinery, or alternatively by design, development and construction of their own bespoke machinery. And growers out there have each undertaken each of those methods so far with success, but it depends upon their skills and indeed time available and resources available to do this work. Without doubt, many growers need to invest either money and or time in more efficient and productive harvesting and processing equipment, either to get the best from their existing equipment via its correct setup, maintenance, and modification, or to consider collaborating together with other growers to develop more efficient harvesting solutions, which still nonetheless maintain acceptable levels of product quality. There may be, and this is sort of a mission to Historic England and others really, a need to encourage and help growers to help themselves. In the past, some organisations have developed appropriate machinery designs and made them available for growers to self-build. Not a normal route to market, I know, but we aren't really going to market here. We're going straight to the user. And unfortunately, nobody else is going to help them. So where are the next steps? These are what are now being considered by Historic England and Historic Environment Scotland, and hopefully will be implemented during 2024. Firstly, to develop technical guidance in conjunction with growers and engineers and publish it to help other growers get the best from their equipment. Now, that might be obtain best performance from the machinery, how to methods to reduce labour and inputs and costs, how to improve straw quality, and also improve working environment and safety at work. In the past, organisations such as the HSE used to do something like that, I seem to remember, but sorry. Okay, possible topics for such things could involve how to convert binder cutting mechanisms to utilise modern combine cutter bar components. Where can you get binder knife sections from? You can't expect old equipment to keep working every year on and on and on and not break down in the middle of harvest. And you can't afford for it to break down in the middle of harvest in the small weather windows we have nowadays. How to adjust, set up and repair binder and trusser, knotter and packer mechanisms. Again, the equipment we're working with, or the industry is working with, is stuff from the 1930s, 1920s and before that. Knotters on balers and other equipment are identical to those on binders in many respects and can be substituted for them. And then the issue of spare parts availability is overcome. Another issue to consider are desirable modifications to commercial big balers to minimise straw damage and optimise crop quality during in-field packaging. An issue with round balers, for instance, mostly the straw we're working with is 3.5 to 4 foot tall. It's nearly 1.2 meters tall. You'll know that the standard width of a large round baler nowadays is 1.2 meters. So it's a bit of a squeeze to get sheaves into a large round baler laterally, but of course that's the way they need to go. They mustn't actually be placed in longitudinally for fear of crushing the straw up. And also basic designs of working area dust extraction for use around crop processing machinery, and recommendations for do-it-yourself guarding of crop processing machinery. All would be beneficial. So we're going to hopefully consider exploring the feasibility of promising machinery concepts which can improve harvesting efficiency and reduce costs, but also maintain straw quality. Some of those concepts could include sheaf collection devices for binders, automatic stooking devices for binders. So they're actually, the stooks are formed and placed in the field without manual involvement. Not so far-fetched as you may imagine. Or perhaps in-field ripening and crop collection without binding and stooking, to eliminate the requirement for the manual labour for stooking. That may be possible, it may not. Self-loading mechanisms for packaging cages, which are used by some growers. Automatic knotting mechanisms for packaging cages so that the strings haven't got to be tied manually, which all takes time. Effective crop feed conveyors for crop processing machinery, into which again can save manpower. So just looking at one of those aspects, automatic stooking, is it so very far-fetched? Well, in actual fact, no, it's not, because they exist, or they did exist in the early 20th century. A very large number of automatic stooking machines and designs were patented in the US in the period, so 1900 to 1925. A number of types were produced commercially, and some even made it to the UK, as you'll see from that picture on the right there, which was taken in the UK. Unfortunately, these machines, which were developed primarily for use on the Canadian and American prairies where the labour wasn't available to form stooks, were made obsolete overnight by the rapid adoption of combine harvesters in those markets. And so they just disappeared, and they weren't taken up in the UK on smaller fields and where they were seen as an unnecessary hindrance to binder operation. But next picture, which is not the best, I'm afraid, just goes to show that things did actually happen. This is a machine actually in work, I believe in Canada. I'll play it twice, because if you look at, it was an actual cross conveyor, which is feeding the sheaves off the binder and up into a collecting drum. And if you watch that drum very carefully in a moment, it actually places a string around it and produces a shook. It even disengages the cross conveyor whilst it produces the shook. All land wheel driven. I'll just run that again just for you to see if I can. I will run it again, because I was quite surprised I actually managed to find the damn thing. You'll see it just about to trip in a moment. I just tripped there. Now, I've come across about 20 designs of these machines. Some look very Heath Robinson and look like they would never work in a month of Sundays. But some obviously did. But whether they would meet the requirements for thatching straw remains to be seen. But of course, we're not under the limitations of land wheel driven equipment in this day and age. However, is attempting to mechanize an existing process the right way to go? For instance, why is the conventionally harvested crop packaged in a sheaf from the binder? Is it for necessary cultural or processing reasons? Is it to permit the in-field ripening of the crop prior to transportation and storage for harvesting? Or was it because there was so much green in old crops with poor weed control that this was, and such a wide window of ripening, that this was the only way to get the crop to ripen all at the same time, and before you put it into the stack to await processing in due course? Or indeed, was it the right size to handle with a pitchfork with a guy on the end of it to fork onto a cart to cart back to the barn? You tell me. Perhaps a combination of all of those factors. But should we attempt to mechanize stooking and the subsequent handling of sheaves, or should we be thinking more broadly? In days gone by, we used to handle fertilizer and seed corn in 50 kilogram sacks, because 100-weight sacks, let's be honest, because that was the way that it was done, because that's what you could lift. I'm not allowed to lift that anymore. And then we took the rather dramatic step of putting things on pallets to save all the humping of bags about the place. And then we moved to large bags. Would you go back to handling seed and fertilizer in 50 kilogram sacks? So should we actually be thinking of not packaging a conventionally harvested crop in sheaves? Should we instead be placing it in windrows? Would that reduce the straw quality? Would it increase the risk of weather damage? In the past, grass seed crops were handled in this way prior to picking up for thrashing by combines. Machinery was even produced to aerate windrowed seed crops with minimal damage. But in the light of the 2023 harvesting season, which was an absolute swine, in many cases, it was only by people putting things in stooks that they actually managed to save the straw. Because the land was so wet in July and there was such poor harvesting conditions, it was fairly touch and go, and it will have adversely affected the availability of thatching straw for this coming season. So perhaps not the best year to be promoting or suggesting radical solutions. But anyway, once you've got stuff in a windrow, of course, you can then mechanize the subsequent crop handling and transfer to the processing machinery much more effectively and efficiently than if it's in individual little bundles. So just a sort of off-the-wall thought. At which point, I think I'll close the presentation and be happy to take your questions.
Thank you for that, Andy. There are a few questions. First one is from Mr. Whiting.
Yeah, it was really just, obviously, you mentioned a few times about the 2023 harvest, and those crops look nice and tall. Is it the fact that they're harvested early that the reason they haven't gone down, or is it the old growth promoters or variety of crop?
No, it can be a real sod, to use the technical term. The fear of crops getting laid, because obviously they are more, for a start, most growers use no straw shortener on them for obvious reasons, because they need the straw to be as long as it possibly can be. That's the hope, that's the objective. And so the risk of crops being laid is very great. Hence, this year has actually seen some crops laid, and binders having to try and pick them up off the ground, when binders aren't the best things to do that half the time. And then, of course, the sheaf, the crop isn't presented nicely to the binder, and so the sheaves become untidy, because all of that handling and packaging in the field into sheaves requires good presentation of the crop to the knotter mechanism in the binder. And so, yeah, I've done a lot of fitting of combine grain lifters onto binder cutter bars this year. It was almost in the middle of July. I was sort of running around, almost sort of being phoned up on a regular basis, and we were sort of sharing sort of best practice between the industry, between people in the industry, trying to say, well, I do this on that and whatever. But yeah, it's a problem. More so even on the stripper harvesting, though, because once it goes down with a stripper harvester, you're stuffed. As a very substantial grower down in Essex explained to the conference we ran on this subject back in June, if the crop goes down, it's game over. That's it. You've lost it. There's no recovery. You then just got to try and put it through a combine, and the straw is useless. You've lost the crop. So it's a big gamble.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The next question was from me, really. There was two parts to it. What sort of acreage is required to do sort of an average cottage?
That, I'm afraid, I can't tell you, because it's not something that I've actually looked into, if I'm frank. I've sort of kept out of the thatching side of things, really, because sometimes growers and thatchers are one and the same. Quite frequently, they are not. And so their specific requirements, their requirements differ to a large extent. Also, the reason for my sort of caginess is because it depends if you're dealing with a complete rethatch where the entire thatch has been stripped off or there's partial stripping out and partial rethatch, or just re-ridging the very top of the roof. And also it depends whether it's combed wheat reed or long straw, because they're put on in different ways. And so there are numerous complexities. There is a specific sort of rule of thumb method, but I'm afraid that was one element of the complexity I didn't get into.
Yeah,
but
so
to answer your question a little bit, there are about 3,500 acres of crop grown in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, and then the next part of my question was the grain. Is the grain that they harvest off the thatch straw then just used as normal for seed or for milling or whatever?
Because even the availability of seed corn is an issue, because in many instances the licenses for the old varieties haven't been maintained, and so growers actually aren't permitted to even sell it to each other.
Right.
It's not, widgeon is commercially available. And I mentioned the use of obviously winter wheat for thatching straw, but also triticale is used as well to an extent. But again, so there's yet a further complexity, and some thatchers won't use triticale, others are more than happy to. Some are all right to use them in certain environments or on certain applications. So the sort of the combinations and permutations of the material used and the quality of the material and the way in which it's been treated and everything else is quite diverse, let us say.
And then just before Paul asks this question, is the different growers, do they know each other? Do they talk to each other? Do they get together? Do they share best practice? I don't know. It's quite a close-knit industry, I guess.
There is a National Thatching Straw Growers Association, which are have embraced me, being extremely helpful to this study during the course of the year. And indeed, the presentation you've just seen is one that I gave to their AGM earlier back in June of this year. However, not all growers are members of that association, and many growers don't have too much to do with each other. Obviously, they're all competing with each other to a certain extent, and it's a very small market. Everybody generally knows everybody else. Whether they talk to each other is another thing, but we did succeed by virtue of this particular piece of work, and me having gone around and seen people during the first quarter of this year. Historic England and Historic Environment Scotland actually organised a growers workshop in June of 2023, and we got a substantial number of the growers together. We got about 50, 60 growers all down in one place, in one building. Indeed, if the bomb had dropped on that building at the time in June, we'd have wiped the UK market out, which would have been not intentional, but an unfortunate outcome. And it went really, really well. We're really, really pleased. And the idea is to go forward and share best practice and encourage communication and working together where possible. But yeah, it's an interesting industry. It's a very interesting industry, Charlie, and I cannot imagine. And I mustn't say too much for fear of I'll be struck down by a lightning bolt coming through. No, they'll never speak to me again. But yeah, they're good old boys. But it's an interesting industry.
Okay, well, we'll just have Paul's question then.
Plowman, it's almost as nitpicking as that. It's.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I'll be quick because I'm conscious it's gone 2 o'clock. And just wondering about the economics of this. I mean, for a 5,000 acre man to frankly, to have 60 acre thatching straw, I was just wondering what the split is for the guy in the value of the straw that he's harvesting on the basis it ends up good enough for thatching, or the grain that was coming off. I mean, the availability of seed is another dimension to this that Charlie's already picked up on. But I mean, these guys aren't doing it for fun, are they?
No, but in many instances, I asked that particular grower, in actual fact, I was wrong. He doesn't have 60 acres, he has about 40. But I said, why don't you have more? And he said, because if I had any more, my staff would leave me. And he was
But it's
because
got to be viable for them, hasn't it?
because they're driving Fence and John Deere 9RXs most of the time, and then they have to spend their life around a threshing drum for a certain number of days in the winter. It's down to focusing in that particular enterprise on product quality in order to get the best value you can from it. But of course, you're still at the vagaries of the weather, and that's probably the worst of it.
Yeah.
I can see, because our weather windows are becoming so awkward. And like this year was such an example where, life became very touch and go in the middle of July. And we were still harvesting and packaging thatching straw was on by the middle of August, which was sort of unknown. And then this autumn again, of course, it's been as wet as hell, and a number of growers haven't got their wheat in the ground, which then bodes badly for next year's harvest, even if it's good. So that sort of a number of sort of perfect sort of cumulative events can create a perfect storm in terms of availability or poor availability of straw. That's why when the equipment works, it's got to work well, and it's got to cover the ground quickly, and you can't be waiting for the availability of labour when you're having to pay people 15, 18 quid an hour to get them to come in the field to do this work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Yanni. That's absolutely fascinating. So thank you for giving us that presentation and taking your time out to do so. It is appreciated. I'm sure everybody found that interesting, because it's just not something you see a lot of. It looked like a vintage tractor working weekend, that did. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you'll join us for our next lecture on the 16th of January, where we'll be joined by Alistair Hayfield, who's going to be talking about future powertrains and efficiency in tractors, so alternative fuels and all that good stuff. So all that's left to say is thanks again, have a good Christmas, and we'll see you next year. Bye-bye.